So today we have a special speaker. This is a fellow that I heard speak, I don't know, a few years ago. Some of you old-timers may remember when he had adventures into the underground of Las Vegas and into the tunnels, and was doing a lot of work with trying to collect provisions for them and giving them away. And that was a long, hard labor on his part. Today he's working on a book that sounds very exciting and very apropos for us living here in Las Vegas. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Josh Ellis.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you all for having me here. And you'll have to forgive me, I am running on fumes. I got about 3 hours of sleep last night, so I'm a little rough. So Cassandra asked me to come up and speak, I think, specifically about this new law that they're trying to enact, or I think they may actually have enacted it. I've been kind of caught up this last week or so, making it illegal to sleep on the streets in Las Vegas. And so the question is, who am I and why the hell would I have anything to say about this? So how many people here know that there are hundreds of people who live in the storm drains under the city? Okay, so back in 2000, long time ago, 2013 or 14, I was the journalist who went down there first and wrote about that and discovered this for the Las Vegas City Life, the alt weekly that's been gone for many years now. And that obviously got a lot of attention, both locally, nationally, internationally. We got my co-author, Matt O'Brien, and I got nominated for Pulitzers, which your publisher does, so it's not that awesome. But still, he goes on the resume. He wrote a very good book that I can recommend called Beneath the Neon, that's about both our travels there and then what he did afterwards, including starting up a thing called the Shine a Light Foundation with Hope of Southern Nevada to help people get out of the storm drains and transition them back into terrestrial living, I guess you would put it. And ever since then, I've kind of been an advocate and kind of done outreach on various scales for the Las Vegas homeless. And as Jerry mentioned a couple years ago, I had what I thought was a pretty cool idea. I went out to the camps down by Four Master and Las Vegas Boulevard, and I asked the homeless people there, what do you need that you can't get? Because, a lot of people will come by and bring them food and things, but the truth is, food's easy. There's lots of people who hand out food, there's lots of charities. There's other stuff that's harder to get. So I asked them what that was, and they told me it was things like deodorant, it was wet naps to kind of clean yourself off with, toothbrushes, it was feminine hygiene products, that sort of thing. So I was thinking about Amazon and the way that Amazon has these wish lists that are made for things like wedding registries. You put up a list of stuff you want, people buy it, but Amazon sends it to you instead of them. So I made a list of all of these supplies that these people had requested, and I have a pretty large following on social media. I have like 4,000 Facebook friends and like 4,000 Twitter followers. And so I said, if you buy this stuff and you send it here, I'll take it out. And that, at the end of that week, I had to buy a shelf for my living room to put all of the stuff that was coming in. The first week we took out 25 gift bags of stuff that was just donated by these people from all over the world. By the time we kind of petered off doing it, I guess you'd say, we were doing about 60 bags a week. And not last year, it was year before last, we had a really bad cold snap in January. One day, like the temperature dropped like 30 degrees. And we were able to go out down to the homeless kind of encampments, and we handed out, I think, 65 sleeping bags, God knows, hundreds of like little blankets and gloves and chemical hand warmers and all that sort of thing. And it was all just stuff that was donated by these amazing people from all over the world, a lot of whom don't live here. And a lot of my friends here locally volunteered to help us make these bags and kind of take them out. I ended up kind of just stopping doing it because I ran out of money, and I basically had to focus on surviving rather than doing this. I was lucky that I was able for a while to just kind of coast, and also it is fantastically suicidally depressing to do this every week. It's really, really emotionally difficult because you feel like nothing. Absolutely, you're not making a friggin' dent in the problem. And the things that you see, I've spent a lot of my time traveling around the world. I've been in the slums of Kibera and Nairobi, and I have seen more absolutely pathetic and horrible examples of cruelty towards humanity right here than I ever have anywhere in the developing world, Mexico, anywhere I've ever been. And there are just things that I'm a writer, so things go in my imagination, they don't come back out. So the third or fourth time you're walking down the sidewalk and there's a 75-year-old, clearly mentally ill man with no legs, lying in the mud next to his own wheelchair, covered in his own feces, smiling and waving at you, telling you he's got a birthday party next week you're invited to, that's when you start the drinking. And you start the drinking real heavy, and it kind of just took a toll. But this new law I've been following with, well, I'm not going to mince words, I've been following it with absolute rage. So basically, if you're not familiar, the law that they're putting out here is that as long as there are available beds in any shelter in Clark County, if you are camping on the sidewalk, in the street, anywhere in public, it's a misdemeanor. You can be arrested for it, you can be fined for it. There's a number of problems with this law. And I tend to be a really blunt person. I don't tend to soft pedal it. So the fact that the lawmakers in this city and in the county made this law does not bode well for the future of our community, because that kind of gross incompetence and inability to do your job is pretty striking, in fact. It's people, they know nothing about what they're doing. I would venture to guess that I know more about the homeless than any single person involved in the making of this legislation, and I'm not even that much of an expert. But I'll explain to you why I say this, because I know that's a strong thing to say. How many people here have ever actually been homeless? Anybody? And when I say homeless, I don't mean just like couch surfing, like street, nowhere, what they refer to as unhoused homeless, as opposed to like, I'm crashing with my cousin or what have you. So, yeah, it's a rough gig. It's a very hard thing to have happen to you. It's a very hard thing to get back out of. It's something that most of us work very, very hard to never have to deal with. I was unhoused homeless for a week or two in 2001 after the dot-com crash, and I've worked my ass off for the last 20 years, never have to go through that again. But, so part of the problem is, the way that the city has set this up is they keep talking about, well, if there's shelter beds, then we're gonna bust you for basically not taking advantage of the resources that are given, which sounds, on the surface, reasonable, right? But here's the problem. There are 400 available beds in Clark County for the homeless. The 2018 homeless census places the number of unhoused homeless at 6,100, just below 6,100 in the valley. And my guess is that's based on, I know how the census was done, that's really low. I would guess it's probably more like 7,500. So even if their numbers are correct, you're talking about a 6.56% availability for beds. And still, there are people who refuse to go into the shelters, which again, may sound crazy on the face of it. Has anybody here ever spent a night in a homeless shelter? You ever seen Victorian England, like depictions of what it was like for the slums of the poor in London? It's kind of like that. The problem is they're very unpleasant and often dangerous places to be. You go in, you're likely to get robbed. Your stuff will be stolen even if you're not attacked. A lot of people in there are mentally ill. They're addicts, like a lot of homeless people. It ain't a fun trip. Beyond that, though, there's other reasons that people don't do this. And these reasons illustrate, I think, what it is that we forget about the homeless, which is that they are, in fact, human beings just like us. So a lot of the shelters are religious-based. So if you want to go into them, you have to sit down and listen to a sermon about Jesus. I think this crowd in particular will understand why that would not be desirable necessarily for a lot of people. A lot of the shelters are dry shelters, which means if you are drunk or high or have been drunk or high in the last 24 hours, you're not allowed in. Again, this is a problem. A lot of them separate couples. They won't allow married couples to sleep together or be in the same area together, or they'll separate out children. Some of them only take women or only take men. Some of them don't allow pets, and of course, a lot of homeless people, that's what they have in the world, is like a dog. That's their companion, and they won't allow them in. And there's no, they're not going to put them in a pet boarding place, you know. So a lot of people avoid them because even if you're homeless, you still don't want to be locked in a place with a bunch of people you don't know. You have no control of your situation. You might be separated from your family or your pets or anything else. You might be forced to undergo religious indoctrination. It's a train wreck is the problem. And this is not to denigrate the people who run these shelters, but you know, there's no money for this. It's the only people who put money at it. The reason for the faith thing, of course, is that the only people who really put money at this are churches. It's like the Catholic Charities here, who are very nice and very well-meaning people, don't get me wrong. But for a lot of people, the choice between that or sleeping on a sidewalk, they'll pick the sidewalk. Now, downtown, a lot of the homeless cluster at the corner of Fourmaster and Las Vegas Boulevard are at Owens, right there in North Vegas on the other side of Bonanza. There used to be a lot more of them downtown, which is where you run into one of my personal pet hobby horses, which is the Downtown Project. Tony Hsieh and Zappos and all of that, when they came in and they gentrified Fremont Street. Y'all may remember that a lot of Fremont Street had those weekly residential motels, right? The Johnny Carson, for example. Now, were those pleasant places to be? No, they were crack dens, honestly. Bad things happen there. But if you were someone who is homeless, a lot of times homeless people get their ID stolen, for example. They don't have a credit rating. They're not going to be able to, even if they have money, be able to get like a lease on an apartment. But you can go in a weekly. So that's where a lot of those people stayed. And if you drive down Fremont Street at night, you'll see all of these hotels that various property developers bought up, which they've left abandoned for the last 6, 7, 8 years. And you'll see the people who used to sleep inside of those places sleeping on the sidewalk outside the chain link fence that they've put up to keep people from sleeping in empty and unused hotels, which were originally designed, and I can tell you because I worked for a startup that was funded by all these people, it was meant to be affordable housing for tech people, because God knows the one thing that tech people don't have is money. And a lot of those properties have been left to rot. If you drive down there, you'll see that they're just falling apart. So those people got pushed out of downtown into basically the edge of the line between Vegas and North Las Vegas. If you go up there, you'll see this. Up until recently, if you drove down there, you would see on those couple of blocks tents just lining the sidewalks. Up along Las Vegas Boulevard, off the side streets, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people. And they're gone now. Well, the people aren't actually gone, of course. The tents are gone. There's a motel down there that the city bought that was abandoned, and they've turned it into a shelter, except not the actual motel, the courtyard. They've put foam, like, what would you call them, cots, pads, foam mats in the courtyard of the motel where people can lay down their stuff and sleep. They can't leave it there, so they're up at 7 a.m., they're woken up and told to get out. So this is part of what they call the Corridor of Hope, which is a name that I take a certain amount of exception to. I know actually from direct experience that a lot of people avoid that courtyard because when the hotel itself, the motel, was closed, it was a really popular place for dragging homeless women to sexually assault them. And I know that because the women told me that. So I can't imagine those women really want to sleep in that courtyard. I assume the city doesn't know this because I assume they don't bother asking. If I sound angry, maybe you understand why I find this situation so absolutely infuriating, and the fact that these people are essentially, we're criminalizing poverty. Now you can say, and a lot of people have very strong opinions on the homeless, they just don't want to work. I was accused by people of encouraging homelessness when I was passing out supplies because, God knows some guy who's sleeping in a dirty sleeping bag in a storm drain, he wants to get out, but if I bring him like an extra couple of safety razors, he's just going to stay down there because he's comfortable. But this is the mentality of Las Vegas, which I have to say, again, I've been here for, this will make it, Jesus, God, 21 years. This is one of the cities with the least amount of empathy that I've ever seen anywhere in the world. This is one of the most absolute cities that is the most absolutely hateful towards the poor. Our city government, and I mean, I'll just be honest, the Goodmans. Carolyn and her husband, Oscar, who was mayor before her, hate the poor. Everything they have done their entire tenure when he was mayor and now that she's mayor has been evidence of that. The people who run the city hate the poor, and they hate the homeless worst of all, because the homeless are an eyesore to the tourists that we bring here. That's why you'll never see people sleeping on Las Vegas Boulevard until you get out of the actual strip, till you start getting north of the stratosphere. Then you see them out there, because the tourists aren't there. But the police will move anybody along who might even remotely remind some beer-drunk stereo salesman from Des Moines who's out here throwing away his grandchildren's college money on the slot machines while he's here for a conference, that there is consequence to throwing away your money, I guess, being poor. Another interesting thing, by the way, you'll hear people say a lot that, well, these homeless people need to just get jobs. They just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's the American dream, right? There's the often quoted saying that's attributed, I think, to, is it Faulkner or to Steinbeck? We don't have poor people in America. We have temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And that's kind of the thinking, is that these people, if they just work a little bit and get out of it, then you're fine. Unfortunately, the problem with poverty in America is that it's a pitcher plant. Once you slide into it, it's very, very hard to get out. And it's another problem with these shelters that I meant to mention earlier. So imagine you're on the street. You don't have a place to live. You know about a shelter. Shelter might be somewhere miles away from where you are, but you know about it. So you go to the shelter and they say, well, you have to line up to first come, first serve. So you start lining up around noon. Does anybody see the problem here? If you want to work, make some money, get yourself out of the situation, what are you going to do? So, especially because if you're homeless, if you're poor, if you're unkempt, if you've been sleeping rough, the only work that's available to you usually is things like yard work or maybe day labor, right? Which happens, where does day labor happen? Edges of the city. So you take your last of your money, you get on a bus out to Summerlin, which takes you 3 hours because our transit system is not the best in the world. So you get up at 5 a.m., you get out there, you do your day labor, you get off at 5, you get back downtown to where the shelters are at 8, and by then, it's done deal. And here's the best part about all of this. So one of the things I had mentioned was that the city said, if there are any beds available, that's when they can criminalize this, right? If you're not taking advantage of the resources. Here's the best part. The city's general counsel, whose name I'm forgetting, but you can find it, was quoted in an RJ article as saying, we're going to keep beds available so that anytime we want to arrest people, we can say that they weren't taking advantage of the beds that we had. I mean, he basically, I'm literally quoting him. I'm not paraphrasing. He said, we're always going to keep some beds available so that this law is in compliance with the Supreme Court. Now think about this. We have 400 beds, 6,100 recorded, probably more like 7,500 homeless, but they're actually going to reserve some of those beds so that if they want to arrest somebody and that person's lawyer decides to call the ACLU and they decide to go to the Supreme Court, they can say, well, no, we have these right over here, right behind this velvet rope. The Orwell, not even Orwell, it's Kafka at this point. I think the Kafkaesque quality of this is staggering to me. But again, the point being that it's never as simple as these are people who just want to sit around and get drunk and not do anything. They're not cartoon hobos from it's like the 1940s where they're just sitting around drinking moonshine with little X's on it and got everything in a knapsack. About a third of homeless people are officially considered mentally ill, but my experience, speaking as somebody who has spent a little bit of time, is that after about a week or two out on the street, I would guess that probably about 90% of homeless people are mentally ill, if you're including PTSD, because, and you'll forgive my language, it is an absolutely fucking horrid way to exist. You go out everyone that sees you treats you like garbage. You'll see people talking to themselves and you think, well, that person's schizophrenic. No, there's nobody else to talk to them. If you ever spent time alone in your house, like after a few days, you'll start talking to your dog, you start talking to yourself. Well, these are people who walk around all day, and every person that sees them wants them gone. They're constantly exhausted because you can't get a good night's sleep, especially here, where in the summertime it's 110 degrees at night, and in the wintertime it's 40 or 30 degrees. But you're out there and you can't really rest, because if you fall asleep deeply, somebody's going to come and take everything you have, or the cops are going to come and arrest you for vagrancy. We always talk about how they're drunks and druggies. Well, you know what? I'd be drunk all the time too if I was out there. I'd be high as hell all the time. And because I knew that none of my money, I was never going to have enough money to get an apartment, get a job, get a car, whatever. So yeah, I got $10. It's going to go for a bottle of Black Velvet. That's what it's going to go for, and a pack of Cools. Honestly, I see no reason to judge people for that. I would do the exact same thing. And frankly, after I was out there for a while, I basically kind of started doing that, just on a slightly better scale. But we don't think about these things, because we just look at these people and we see dirty people, crazy people, scary people, people we think are lazy because they're just sitting around. But they're not sitting around because they're lazy. They're sitting around because they ain't got nothing to do, because they can't get a job, they can't get a house, can't get a car. And they've been so completely marginalized by society that it's not like they're, going to be hanging out at the Boulevard Mall, being good consumers. So what do? What do we do with them? One of the funny things is Carolyn Goodman has suggested that we take the old prison out at Jean and turn it into housing for the mentally ill, which is a suggestion so... Jesus, the balls of this. So when you take a bunch of people who have committed no crime and you put them all behind barbed wire, we have a name for that. That's called a concentration camp. It was a concentration camp in Germany. It's a concentration camp in Russia. Under Stalin, it's the same thing. These are people who have committed no crimes. She wants to put the mentally ill there, which is even worse. If it were people who had actually committed crimes, it's still horrible, but okay. No, that's just where they want to house people who are too mentally ill to survive in our society. So she wants to take them out into the middle of the desert, miles from anything except for, God help us, Jean and Prim. And what? Just put them there? What are you going to do with them? You can't. How are they going to reintegrate themselves into society? You're going to send a couple of psychiatrists out once a month to do like rounds maybe for a day and just kind of do prescriptions? How are they going to get back into town? How are they going to try to do anything other than just be a bunch of, frankly, crazy people locked in a barbed wire cage in the middle of the Mojave Desert? That's mystifying to me, how you could even remotely... How could you? It staggers the brain that they would think that that's a reasonable solution. But that is the solution they want. In the same way that for many years, Las Vegas has done what a lot of cities do. Y'all may remember a couple years ago they discovered that we were taking mentally ill, indigent people and buying them a one-way bus ticket to San Francisco and giving them a sack lunch with a bologna sandwich and a Coke. And we're talking about people, disordered schizophrenics, people who are not capable of functioning. And we were just putting them on a bus and sending them out to San Francisco. Which is better than what I heard they used to do in the 60s. They used to just take them and bus them out to the edge of Nye County, drop them off in the desert. Just let them figure it out. And I think that a lot of the property owners and the business owners downtown, I think that that's actually something they would be totally fine with. I say that as somebody who has friends who are business owners downtown who own houses in the Huntridge district in the downtown area. People who, sure, they got the "I'm with her" sticker on their bumper, and they're absolutely liberals until it comes to their property values. And when it comes to their property values, we can take all of those dirty hobos and leave them out in the desert for the fucking coyotes to pick their bones. I don't think I'm exaggerating at all. Now, they might deny it, but they can't do it with a straight face. So what do we do? I guess that's the real question. As a city, as a society, how do we deal with this? And there's been one really good answer to that question. It's been proven over and over again. Does anybody know what it is? How do you fix homelessness? You give people houses. That's it. It's that simple. There's no trick answer. That's it. Up in Utah, they built houses for the homeless. They gave them to the people, and they stopped being homeless. And they started getting themselves back on their feet because that was one less thing to worry about. When they've done it in LA, they've taken old motels there, and instead of leaving them abandoned so some .com douchebag could have his little Burning Man fantasy in the middle of the poorest part of the city, they renovated them and they let people live in them. And those people, once they'd gotten over the shock of their situation, much like somebody who's been at war, you know, they're not going to get there and the next day they're not going to get a job. They need a little bit of time to just basically decompress. Those people start reintegrating themselves in society. They start working to get themselves out of their addictions. They start working to find work. They start working to better themselves. Nobody's going to do that if they're in jail or if they're in Gene, which is worse, even if you're not locked up, I think. That's it. You give them houses. And it's not that expensive. It's more expensive, as they discovered in Utah. It's more expensive to constantly send cops to deal with the homeless, to constantly jail them, to feed them and house them, to do all of these things, to have to, the hospitals, you know, when people come in for minor infractions because they don't have insurance. It's easier to just build a bunch of little damn houses for them. It saves the taxpayer money, and it treats them like humans. And that's really one of the biggest things that I think the reason that these kind of laws are allowed to exist is because a lot of us, frankly, don't. We don't think of them as human. We think of them as being just like pigeons or rats. They're just something that's in the city. You're walking down the sidewalk here on Maryland Parkway, I know very well, and there's some poor dude sitting there and he's just kind of talking to himself like this, and you got a quarter, and you're mildly irritated because he asked you for a quarter, and you say, no, I'm sorry, and he's like, all right, God bless, and maybe that guy smells weird, and maybe it freaks your kid out. The funny thing is, though, is that a lot of the people who hate these homeless people, they always talk about how they're, you know, we give value to the community. These people take value away from their community. But I've lived here a long time. There are homeless people who hang out right here on the corner of Maryland and Harmon who I've been talking to for 20 years. They've been here much longer than these fly-by-night little shitty dispensaries or the smoke shops or the crappy little sandwich shops that come and go every 6 months, and yet whose owners feel that they have some entitlement to that space that is different from the person who's been sitting there for a generation. And some of the people I've met down there, they're nice people. They're extremely nice people. There's one guy, he goes to Walmart down here, he used to come down here, calls himself Wizard, a couple different things. He's mentally ill. Big, tall, if you're ever down here and you see a really tall homeless guy, like a mustache, kind of, I guess, 40s, late 30s, early 40s, that's him. Marius Wizard, he has different names. And he is one of the kindest people I've ever met. My ex-wife, when we lived down in this area, if he saw her at night walking alone, he would walk her to our house. He wouldn't ask for anything, wouldn't bother her, just make sure she was safe. And considering how much of the crime, particularly in this neighborhood, has been due to the neglect by the property owners and managers of all of these properties that used to be so vibrant, who's the one who's the real threat to the neighborhood? Is it the indigent guy? Or is it some prick who wants to try and up the rent for $6,000 for a storefront on Maryland so he can take the tax break year after year after year as the entire neighborhood falls apart? I don't know, but my bet's on Marius, personally. So I apologize if I'm rambling because, again, as I said, 3 hours sleep. But I think it's clear that I don't think this law can stand. I think they're going to try, and the first time that they bust anybody, the ACLU and every civil liberties group in America is just going to leap on them like Wolverine and just and good, frankly. And I hope it costs the city a lot of money, and I hope people lose their jobs. I hope whoever that legal counsel is who actually had that quote about keeping beds available just to be able to put people in jail, I hope that bitch loses his license, frankly, because that's just that's something you should never hear from the general counsel of a city. That's just some Gestapo shit. But I think that as a city, if we band together, one of the things that we can do is simply, when we see people on the street, help them break this law. Just break it. Absolutely violate it. Yes?
It seems there's really widespread support for the concept of minimum wage.
Yeah.
And a minimum wage, really nobody is arguing against it.
Well, Breitbart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yet the idea of mandatory minimum housing seems like an absolutely isometric concept. Really no substantive difference.
But we're also the only country that's considered the developed world by the UN that doesn't have minimum medical care. I mentioned earlier Kibera, and this is something I've actually been really, really thinking about a lot. So Kibera is the largest urban slum in Africa. It's in the city of Nairobi. It's in this little valley. It's exactly what you think about. When you see movies and TV in the African slums, it's usually Kibera. It's kind of a hellhole. And yet the people there are walking around every day. They're happy. They're doing what everybody does. They're listening to music on their phone. They're eating, trying to have sex with each other, whatever it is people do, smoking weed, raising pigs. There's a lot of pigs. I'm okay. I don't know why, but there's just pigs everywhere. But the thing is, I started thinking about it, and the difference between Kibera and Nairobi, or the favelas of Rio, if you ever see the big, like the city of God, like all the squats around in Rio, or in Ankara, Turkey, where I used to live when I was a kid. Do you know the difference between a place like Kibera and the camps up on Las Vegas and Fort Master is? Time. If they didn't move those people out. They didn't force them out. They didn't take their stuff, and if they weren't gone by dawn, throw it into the street, which I have personally witnessed the police here doing. And so communities built, and they are legitimate communities. And one of the funny things, actually, that this whole shelter thing reminds me of is, I was in Kibera and I was talking to people about this thing that the Nairobi city government tried to do, where they built apartment buildings and gave these people apartments. If you lived in Kibera, they just flat out gave them the apartments. People said, great, thanks. And they rented out the apartments, and they took the money, and they still lived in the slum where there's one toilet per 10,000 people. Because home is home. And communities aren't based on whether you have money or whether you all have the same politics or whether you're all good citizens who are committed to economic growth. And it's one of the things that always made me very angry about the downtown project's idea of community, which was people we want to hang out with. And that's a bad idea for how a community works. A community is just people who are in a place together who have to coexist one way or another, whether they're homeless, whether they're billionaires, whether they're alcoholic old mob lawyers who used to be mayor and now run a titty bar and steak joint or whatever the hell it is. But all those people make up the Las Vegas community. You can't exclude any of them just because you don't like their clothes or because they don't have money. But in America, we think that. We think if you're poor, you don't matter. You literally can be bussed out to the desert to die. And my time is up, I think.
We take 5 minutes for questions, but we need to pass the mic.
Sure, gotcha. Okay, so I can do that too. So if anybody has any questions to ask me, I'll see if I think I can do it. I'll just kind of.
I just have one. You say give the people houses, but what other kind of support would go along with that?
Honestly, mostly it's just the same support they would get if they were in a shelter. It's the same access to services.
But the people who still donate food and.
Oh, got you, right. So his question was, in addition, if you do just build people houses, what else do you do? And the answer is, yeah, basically you would do the exact same thing you would do now, except instead of taking that food to a bunch of people sleeping on foam in this courtyard, you take it to the people who actually have walls and a door. That's pretty much it. And it turns out that just having their own space, their own walls and a door that they're not going to be moved on from, that's the kickstart. That's the bootstrap that they need. It's just a baseline, and you get people to the baseline, and they'll always find ways to improve themselves. You'll see a lot of conservatives say, well, if you give them houses, they're just going to sit around bored. Would you? No. I never understand that idea. If you put me in a house for more than a couple of weeks with nothing to do, I'm going to do something. And if it's a crappy house, the thing I'm going to do is going to figure out how to get a better house, which is going to be probably getting a job. Right? But I don't know why they think that these people are somehow different, except again, it goes back to the same idea. They're not human like we are. They're not real people like we are. They're roustabouts or whatever weird 19th century idea of, the lazy hobos, I swear to God, is what is in these people's heads and out of a cartoon. But yeah, that's it. Give them food. You give them the same stuff, but it's a lot easier to get to that stuff if you know that you have a place to go back to. I think that's the short version. Sure, yes.
More of a comment. This is not just a Las Vegas issue. It's happening all over.
Oh, God, yes. She points out that it's not just a Las Vegas issue, it's happening all over the country.
I mean, San Francisco, when I was in college there in the 90s, passed a law about you can't sit on the sidewalks for more than like 5 minutes or something.
I lived between 6th and 7th on Market.
Yeah, I lived in the Tenderloin.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. I lived across from Hollywood Billiards, where I once saw these guys Molotov a car in front of my apartment. But
So, yeah, I mean, it's so, we gotta do more than just one city. And, there's, in the South, there's a lot of places where it's now illegal to feed the homeless.
that started here. We were the first place that did that. That was Mr. Oscar Goodman, who, I don't know if you all remember, he played himself in the movie Casino as as a mob lawyer. Yeah, I can't remember the real guy's name at the moment, but Joe Pesci's character. Yeah, it was Tony Spilotro and Goodman. After our Storm Drains pieces come out, Goodman said he went on Cop 92.3 and said there was no homeless problem in Las Vegas. And this was even back then. And so Matt O'Brien and I went on there as well, and they said, what do you think of that? I said, well, if Mayor Goodman can go more than a block in Las Vegas and think there's no homeless problem, he must be suffering from a long-standing and debilitating addiction to crack cocaine, because only a crackhead could believe that. So they went and told him, well, Josh Ellis from the City Life said that. And Goodman, they had like an open forum thing. He's like, I'd like to see him say it to my face. And Matt O'Brien had to physically restrain me, because I was like, oh, let's do this. I was like, you really don't. I will pimp slap you up and down the I-15 from one end of the valley to the other. You alky piece of shit. I will beat your ass red. And Noah Bryan's like, don't hurt him. Don't hurt him. I was so angry. But yeah, there's no love lost between me and them, as you can imagine. But yeah, no, I was in L.A. recently downtown, and the Nickel, 5th Street, the original Skid Row. It's actually, the Skid Row is a real place. It's not just like a concept. It's worse than I've ever seen it. I lived in LA for years, lived in San Francisco for years. It looks like something out of a cyberpunk novel. It is horrifying. We're not doing better, we're doing worse everywhere. But to answer your thing real quick before I go to you, it's sort of a think globally, act locally thing. We only have control over what we're doing. We have to start somewhere, and we might as well start here, I think. So yes.
Yeah, I mean, in Los Angeles, they're awful. There are, kind of blocks set up on Wilshire Boulevard near Fairfax,
Yeah.
not just in downtown.
Yeah.
And they interviewed one person that, cleaned up every day, and he had a full-time job, and, he still had to live there because
Yeah.
it's not affordable.
Right. So she's saying that that in LA now there's just blocks and blocks of these tents, where it's just tents, literally the entire sidewalk all the way down the block for Wilshire and Fairfax, not just downtown. And she was mentioning a guy who got up, cleaned himself, went to work every day, but he came home there because that's what he had. The first night that I went down to the camps down at Owens and Las Vegas Boulevard, across from the cemetery there in that big empty lot, which has been cleaned out now, they were telling me there was a couple there who they both worked. And one day they went to work, both of them, to their different jobs on the bus, and the police came, and they told everybody who was there they needed to get their stuff out or it would be thrown away. But they were at work. So this couple came home from work to find that everything they owned in the world, the police were slashing the tents with razors, so they couldn't pull them out of the trash and use them again. So everything that these people had was destroyed because they weren't there to protect the little they had, because they were at work trying to make better for themselves. And that's why I get so angry. That's why, to me, it's not just an abstract idea. It's clobber and tie. But yes, it's everywhere. This is America. It's Vegas is a very good microcosm of our entire nation, I think, and I've always thought that. Whatever Vegas is, that's what the rest of America is. We are the pure, distilled, Hunter Thompson heart of the American dream. And if you stand on a high hill in Las Vegas and look west, you can still see the high water mark where the wave finally broke and rolled back, as Hunter said. One more. So.
You build a whole bunch of houses and build them all in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
How about we just build a slum? And is that a value?
Well, yes and no. He said, if we build a bunch of houses all together in one place, haven't we just built a slum? Yes. Yes, we have. But let me submit this idea to you. Poor people have to live somewhere. one of the problems that we have in urban development is that we want every neighborhood to be better and have not slums, right? Broke people got to live somewhere, and it's either that or the budget suites. And I don't know if you ever spent time in those places, but Jesus God, I would rather live in a storm channel than live in the budget suites. But yes, it would be a slum. It'd be like a housing project, absolutely. But that's better than nothing. It's better than being persecuted. It's better than being locked up. Having a shitty house is better than having no house at all, unless it's a shitty house that you're locked in and it's like not really your house. That's kind of the thing too about the shelters. It's not really their space. It's a space. It reminds me of the way that Victorian prostitutes in London and the poor used to have courtyards where they would hang string a rope from one end of the courtyard to the other, and you would pay I don't even know what the hell they're, sovereign or a guinea or whatever the hell they were using back then, to lean against it to sleep. Prostitutes, the poor, you would literally sleep leaning up against this rope. And in the morning, the guy who owned the parking lot, but that's actually kind of an apt metaphor, human parking lot, guy would walk in, unhook the rope. Everybody falls over and it's time to get up. And I think there's a lot of people in the city who've seen no problem with doing that. So yeah, I mean, it would suck. There's no doubt that it would suck. There's always gonna be problems. But that's a better problem than the one we have now, I think, personally.